Evening. My name is Deep Wala. I have Brooks Kedar as my partner here, and we both are the panelists today. Today, our webinar is about evaluation of leadership theory. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to go over some logistics. So during the webinar, if you have any question, you can type your question on the right panel under the question section, and we will address all your questions after a webinar during the Q&A session, that is the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So webinar is from 6 to 7, and let me introduce today's speaker. Jeff is a principal with Firefly Consulting. He has over 25 years as a result-oriented advisor with extensive experience consulting in all areas of organizational transformation and process innovation. Jeff has demonstrated expertise in Six Sigma, design, lean, change management, re-engineering, as well as strategic and performance planning. Jeff has successfully deployed process improvement and design initiatives in global logistic distribution, chemical, financial services, semiconductor, construction materials, industrial automation, medical manufacturing, combat operations, and service companies ranging from 40 million to 40 billion in annual revenue. Jeff holds a PhD in leadership studies, an MBA e-commerce, and a BS in management of information system. And he is a senior member of ASQ. So let me welcome Jeff. Jeff, this is your time, please.
All right, thanks, Deepak. I want to just say welcome everyone who's come to listen to this discussion this evening. I hope you'll find something interesting as we go through. I know that over the past 25 plus years that I've had the peripheral study of the concept of leadership, it never ceases to amaze me just what we do and don't know about the concept. So some of the things that I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a background on what we're going to talk about is we'll do a quick introduction. I wanted to kind of get around this whole concept around leadership and management and roles and positions and how we have unpacked this concept of leadership over the past several 150, close to 200 years that we've been really focusing on some of the concepts around it. We'll take a little bit of a look at we'll talk about behaviors and situations and different styles and what happens to a leader and followers as we kind of go through this whole thing. And then while there are hundreds and hundreds of models and theories and philosophies around that, we just don't have the time, nor would you have the patience to listen and sit and listen to all that. So we'll kind of take a little bit of a pick and choose some of these ones that I've been closely associated with over the years and take a look at some of the pros and cons as we kind of do that. So just to kind of give you a little bit more background around how I came to kind of get interested in this concept of leadership is I spent 20 years, 11 days, and 15 minutes in the Air Force and was part of the first group as in the early 90s as we started rolling out TQM, and which later then became, kind of Six Sigma before Six Sigma was cool. And as we started looking at different organizations within the Air Force and within the Army and some of the joint service areas, every time we started having some issues with deployments and we started having problems with trying to get the point across and trying to figure out what is it that's causing us to not be able, all of this just makes perfect sense. So why are we having problems getting these concepts deployed? And almost as if it was like a yellow card in soccer, it was, well, it's a leadership issue. You know, if we only had good leaders, boy, this would all be great. So, but okay, that's fine. We have a leadership issue in the military. This was the late 90s, as I was kind of getting my last few years in. Once I left that, I started working in industry, and I started hearing the same thing. Gosh, if we only had good leaders, if we only, you know, it's a leadership issue, what are we going to do? So I did like everybody else who's confused about a concept. I went out and got a PhD on the subject. So I can tell you definitively, while I clean my glasses, trying to look professorial, that leadership is not at all easy to understand. There are, I mean, just for instance, if you go out and, you know, those of you keeping track at home, if you just Google what is a leader, you're going to get about 52 million different things that tell you, hey, this is what a leader is. If you take and just expand that just slightly to what is leadership, you can see, you know, about 74 million results. So, you know, it's not surprising that there's a lot of confusion over what is, you know, what is this thing we call leadership. And just to even make it more succinct, that in about the last 60 years, we've come up with about 65 different classification systems, all purport to say, we understand what leadership is, and here it is. And then we roll on to the next one from an academic / scholarly / research kind of background. Now, there's tons of philosophical discussions out there, and there's tons of folks who over time, you know, going back to, you know, the Odyssey and the Iliad, who have explained leaders and what leaders should do. But what we're talking about more, and you can see that as you go through history, there's been a lot of discussion about what a leader is and what leaders should do. And usually it kind of comes from some frustration with where the current thinking is, or the current leadership or monarchy or clergy or et cetera, where they are as far as what they are, what they're doing, and what they should be. So, you know, over time, we started to try to codify and solidify and kind of look at the different pieces and chunks and study bits. And from that, you know, if we roll into, and we're going to jump way fast forward into the late 1800s. And we'll start looking at, as we kind of go this little snapshot, if you will, really the initial work in looking at what is leadership really only focused at men in leadership positions. So they looked at that and they said, well, you know, this is what a leader is. The first individuals that kind of talked about it weren't researchers. They were people who had an opinion, and they wrote that down and they sent it into the wild, and everybody went, okay, that kind of works. And, you know, so they started with that. And then by the early 1900s, the people started asking, and people, when I say people who research this, or scholars and people that look at it, started asking, well, if these are what great leaders look like, what made them so? And one of the things that we've kind of seen as you kind of go through here is, as we developed a new theory, and as we started taking that theory and advancing it, and even when we come up with new theories, we never put the old theories away. So we just keep adding to and keep studying and keep rearranging and keep taking it apart and going on. So in those early 1900s, we started questioning, well, if these are what makes a man a good leader, then, and I said that on purpose, then, you know, they started questioning, is it certain traits that are inherent in this individual, or are there certain characteristics? And we'll talk more about that as we kind of go along. And then around the mid 1900s, we started saying, well, gosh, is leader and leadership different? And started to bring in the concept of followers. And once that started bringing in other concepts and other pieces like that, it really started to explode. We started questioning roles. We started questioning position. We then tried to get rid of, can we tease out the concept of management? Can we get that out of the concept of leader and leadership? And how do we all do that? And looked at power versus influence. basically what we did over the past 150 years was to take this concept, kind of like an old transformation formula, and say, okay, if this is leadership, what is it composed of? And how do we measure? And how do we get our arms around these different pieces? And how do we look at it? And how do we tease out its little fundamentals so we can exclude everything that isn't leadership and look just at that one piece? And so, as you can see, we started looking a lot around relationship between followers. We started bringing that term into it and saying, the led versus the leader, and saw, in some cases that this whole concept could be defined as a process or a transaction, which as a process guy made us kind of happy because we could now take a look at it from that standpoint. And then people started saying, well, we need a more holistic approach, and started looking at this whole continuum, and an emphasis on the betterment of the followers. And that's kind of where the end of the 1900s wound up. And as we started looking into the early 2000s, some new concepts started coming out of that. And we started bringing in values and ethics and morals. I mean, these are horrible qualities for leaders to have. So we started looking at those kind of things, and we're starting now to advance those discussions. So that's just a quick snapshot of kind of some of the things we're going to talk about kind of as we run through and take a little bit more in depth on a couple of these different topics as we move through. So a lot of those studies and a lot of the academic literature from before World War II, which turned out to be kind of a pivotal moment in the US for the study of leaders and leadership, were more focused on the characteristic of the person themselves. After World War II, we started breaking that connection again between leaders and leadership. And then, that's carried us through for quite a while. And then now we're starting to see kind of a melding of the many. So we took it apart, and now we're starting to put it back together in different ways and looking at different conditions and different concepts and pieces. And one of the things that I've always found most interesting is if you ask anybody to define leader, everybody has a definition. Put 5 people in a room, you'll get at least 6 definitions. And those definitions have really, if you think about it, have kind of changed over time, many of them, as it looks. And so you see things like back in the early 1920s, where this whole idea of leadership is the ability to impress the will of the leader upon those who are led to induce obedience, which is a very interesting definition that kind of says, I'm the leader and I'll tell you what to do and you go do it and everything will be happy. And you can see this in many corporations, you can see this in many organizations, you can see this culturally, you see it in different industries, companies, countries, all those kind of things, that there is this thought that, I am the smart one, I will tell you what to do, and my job as a leader is to induce obedience, which is fine, but there's some problems with that, in that it's kind of hard to teach, and it's kind of hard to develop, and you wind up with this whole thing around, is that really good, or is it good for the leader? Then you see ones that are a little more up to date, and this one particularly is one of my favorites, and one that I've used quite a bit as I talk to different groups about this theory and concept, is that it's a process, and we use influence, and it's about groups and achieve common goals. And one of the things that I like a lot about some of these things is it takes the requirement to be in a leader position out of the equation, whereby a small group, you can have a group leader. You start seeing the process of emergent leadership starting to show up, and it's a process where it has a beginning, it has an end, and where we're using influence and not induced obedience in order to obtain. And then the part I think is probably the most beneficial in kind of looking at these kinds of definition is around this concept of achieving a common goal. I liken this back to anybody who's ever played on a successful sports team. If you think of that coach as the leader, there was a process where, everybody knew their part and there was a common goal and we all worked together to achieve that common goal. There was a vision, and groups within that, whether they be disparate groups, all understood what it was that we as a group were trying to do. In previous definitions, and like the one above, you see that as being, it's my vision and you're going to go get it for me. And you can kind of see where that whole inclusiveness and a process and kind of falls a little by the wayside. The other piece of this is, again, being a process guy, is a little bit easier for me to understand and kind of get my brain around. So with that, one of the first theories that kind of started the whole discussion around formalizing the work in the study of leadership. And this one, a lot of scholars say we really don't even consider this one of the theories because there was absolutely no academic research. It's just this gentleman, Tom Carlyle, Scottish writer, who said, hey, guys, you got to believe it. Great leaders are God-gifted. They're not man-made. You can't, you can't expect, you couldn't teach Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or any of these great leaders. You couldn't teach them to be great leaders. They just were. And probably about 20 years later, in keeping with good academic rigor, another gentleman by the name of Herbert Spencer said, no, you're wrong. And so it started this whole discussion around, are they a product of their times, or are they a result of the social condition? Is it that the situation created the leader or the leader created the situation? So again, a lot of interesting things happening back, between the 1800s and early 1900s, when they weren't worried about World War I, bubonic plague, stuff like that we were finally able to kind of look at, well, let's just write about it and we'll produce more of our opinion around this whole concept of leadership. And primarily what they did was they looked at clergy, politicians, they looked at the royalty, and they said, well, see, these are great leaders. You couldn't make this stuff up. You couldn't teach these people to be great leaders as we go through. So a couple of the pros and cons on the great man theories was kind of hard to argue. They see there was a great leader. Okay, must be the great man theory. The downside is there's kind of no research, really hard to teach, and there was no real good definition of what a good leader looked like. It was all in the opinion of the people doing the writing. And so, again, as somebody that likes to look at data and look at, facts and look at examples and kind of those kind of things, it makes it hard to get around that and say, well, okay, that's interesting. So then probably around the early 1930s, more research and more people started kind of looking at this concepts. And this is where we started seeing where they took those great man concepts and said, okay, what was it about them that made them good leaders? So we still focused on people in leadership positions, still believe they were, born to be leaders, but, the better leaders were better with these types of traits, which kind of makes sense. And again, these theories don't die and they didn't disappear. You still see a lot of, anybody that wants to spend an afternoon doing it, driving their brain insane, jump onto Google Scholar and just start Googling up the academic research or the research papers on any one of the theories that we'll talk about, and you'll see stuff spanning, thousands and thousands of pages of interesting studies and research that have gone on looking at different pieces and chunks of this. So when I say by the late 40s and then on through the 70s, they started identifying some other things. They also conceptually, the concept of situation started to creep into the discussion. Because a couple of the researchers noticed that, gee, in this situation, a leader with this trait, that group tended to fare better. What better was hard to describe, but they kind of fared a little better. Then in other groups, in another situation, not so much. So they kind of expanded. One of the things I liked a little bit here around, they started expanding who they considered to be great leaders. So we added in, names like Catherine the Great, Joan of Arc, Indira Gandhi, even Napoleon showed up as, hey, let's take a look at these leaders and let's start taking a look more at what their traits were. And then started looking at then that discussion around follower came into play, and does the situation that the leader and the followers get themselves in, how does that impact? What sort of bearings does that have on it? And then they started talking about, maybe we're not talking about traits, but we're talking about the characteristics of leadership, and how do we get behind those, and how can we kind of model those? The unfortunate part was they really didn't come up with a whole lot of commonality. You can see in one group, motivated object, they said, you know what, the big things that make a great leader are, number one, they're intelligent, they're men, and they're domineering. Okay, those sound good. Again, hard to teach, a little biased towards men, but okay, there they are. Stodgel's, his were a little bit more expansive in that they included, things like alertness and persistence and self-confidence. And then you kind of see late in this area, late as they started walking through these things, they started saying, well, gosh, are we really talking about traits, or are we talking about characteristics? Now, again, potato, how do you, are we just taking traits and nailing two of them together and calling it a characteristic? There's a lot of debate that goes around on that. And you start asking the question of like, well, great, any one of these is good, but how do you measure these things? If I put in front of you and said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how smart is smart? Okay, do we go purely by IQ? How do you measure masculinity, dominance? I'm sure there's probably things. But over time, we started to see a couple of different tools and instruments start showing up that are part of the leadership trait questionnaires that are starting to come out, that have been out for a while, that you kind of say, well, here's how I feel about this, and you get almost like a 360 kind of assessment, and it kind of puts together a kind of a profile that says, well, here are the traits you think you have, and here are the traits your people think you have, which can be eye-opening to some and concerning to others. So that was begin the work that we saw in trait theory. So some of the pros and cons around trait theory was, hey, it's appealing and kind of fits what we think of leaders. Is the other piece too is there's about 100 years of research behind it. So it's got a lot of good academic rigor and research and measures and measurements and normalizing data and predictive and all good sort of stuff that goes on in academia. And it also gives us kind of a benchmark of what to look for. So you want to be a leader, these are the traits you need to have. I can start as an individual, start saying, well, gosh, I'm kind of low on that whole dominance thing, so I guess I better work on that. And you can kind of look at some of these other things and go in there. Some of the downside, after 100 years of research, we really don't have a list. Everybody says, well, it's different things, which, okay, fine. The academics tend to do that a lot. The other thing is, the traits not necessarily take the situation into account. They've looked at the person. They've decided that this is a person we want to look at. We're going to go through and look at their traits, and we're going to use those to create an instrument that we're then going to go use to qualify that says, hey, how do you rate against these traits of this great leader? So again, doesn't take the situation. And the other piece is, again, taking a look at the link between what we would call the traits or characteristics in this case, and the outcomes of the leader. I can tell you in kind of a sidebar, looking at the outcomes when it comes to leadership has been another discussion. What does good leadership produce? Talk amongst yourselves. It's one of those things that it has become hard to say what is good and then what has good accomplished. Anybody that's tried to measure that has run into that problem at some point in their discussions. So all that intrigue aside, we can roll into the post-World War II, which was kind of a watershed, at least in the U.S., as far as trying to understand what we saw and what things worked and didn't work. Because some of the research started at that point, looking at the effectiveness of those that were being led. And one of the bigger names you can see a number of books and a lot of research by James McGregor Burns, was someone who was actually a combatant during World War II. And he began to realize that even in units where there were no officers, there were no people in leadership positions, those fighting units were more effective in the absence of the officers. And he started kind of doing some research and started looking around and saying, you know what, I think the historians have exaggerated the role and have ignored what the people that were being led were able to accomplish when they started working as a team and started coming together and understanding a common, we go back to that Norhaus definition of a common vision and what can happen when people with a common vision get in trouble. So there was a huge amount of research, and probably those of us who study this concept, we kind of zero a lot back to a set of studies and a lot of research done by Ohio State and the University of Michigan. And independently, as they started looking at leaders throughout, trait theory and some of the great men theory, and then some of the stuff that they were seeing as a result of leadership within World War II and World War I, et cetera, they started noticing that, what they're seeing is there needs to be a balance in the concern for those being led and a concern for getting the job done. That when there was a balance between these two pieces, that the success, and again, again, it's hard to measure what do we mean by success. So in this case, they were talking about, the fighting units being successful and other organizations, and they took this theory and then expanded it throughout other areas. So they started saying, there's this kind of seesaw or teeter-totter, if you will, that says, I need to take care of my people, but I need to get the job done. And so when do I make my trade-offs? As somebody in a leadership, as the leader of this group, how do I balance that? And there were a great number there continue to be a great number of models and research that take a look at this and say, underneath all of it, we've got to go back to this balance of concern for the follower and concern for the mission. And this is when the leadership behavior then became contingent on that situation. What's going on, and how do I then balance these two pieces? And more of that research showed that there's really not one leadership style. And many of us can, attribute to, you've seen in the past where somebody with a leadership style was very, very successful. But then when they moved them to another place that had a different situation, they cratered horribly, because it's got to be this understanding that there's no one style and there's no one situation, and it's an ever evolving back and forth between the two. And here we're starting to get away from this leader versus management and position versus role, but we haven't really completely broken those two links, so we can kind of set those four things aside and study them independently. And a lot of good models and a lot of good predictive models and a lot of good research came out during these time frames, all the way up into today. I mean, this is still situational, these behavioral theories are still pretty well in place today, and they've got tons of research to support them. In fact, there are a couple of models which I'll show here in a little bit that have everybody's seen them. Just about almost all organizations have in some way or another kind of used them in their leadership development or their management development discussions. But we started seeing again about this time some of the movement away from a person to more of a conceptual role, and then also being able to split out this, here's the things the leaders do and here's the things managers do. And while you'll never find, while we talk about them in somewhat mutually exclusive discussions, I've yet to meet somebody who was 100% one or 100% the other. And regardless of what arena we tend to be in, we tend to see that we contain both a leadership and a management role. I know in industry, when we work with different groups, different teams, you'll have a team. Well, there'll be that in that team leader, there will be people who will take that mantle of team leader, and they're going to have the kind of the obligation to establish the vision, make sure everybody understands the motivation, the inspiration piece. But yet at the same time, I, as that team leader, I've got to make sure that all these other things, the planning, the organization, get the right people, all this sort of stuff, has to make sure. But now, from purely thick glasses, overstuffed chair, Brandy Sniffner discussion standpoint, once I'm able to get those two things teased apart nicely, I can go after and look about, well, what is it that I do as a leader to do these things? What behaviors, what sort of pieces do I bring to the table? From this work and from work very similar, there's two models which I'm pretty sure if you haven't seen them, you probably will at some point in your career. And this is the Blake and Luton, their leadership grid, and then the Hershey and Blanchard leadership curve. These two have probably been the most trained, the most taught, the most discussed of saying, hey, I've got to balance this people concern. You can see that in the Blake and Luton very clearly. I've got to have the concern for the people and the concern for the mission, and concern for the task. And if I don't get this right in the appropriate place, you can see, where you might have some issues that, and you can see again that, how do I help? Do I have, high emphasis on the people, but low emphasis on the task? Well, gosh, the people are going to be happy, but we're not going to get anything done. The other end is, I don't care about the people, let's just get things done. So you can kind of see, and maybe you can go back to some situations where you kind of felt like you were getting beat over the head. You're not quite sure why, and you go, oh, okay, I see what's going on. There was a lot more concern about getting this whatever done than there was about making sure that everybody understood what it was about and just kind of get out there. It's more focus on the obedient side. The other one, the Hershey and Blanchard, and I got to admit, this is one of my personal favorites because it's really complex and it's scary to look at. And the thing I like about it is one of the pieces I like is it brings the development of the leader the development of the follower into play, and starts to look at, gee, if you're new and you don't know what you're doing, and you're willing, you're not sure. Well, then as a leader, I have a quadrant here that, that my interaction with you, my relationship with you as a person, as somebody that's in this group, within this sphere of my influence, I need to be a little bit more guiding and directing to help you gain that confidence and get you moving along so that you can get up to where you're moderately revvy, you're a little better on the scale, you're more over that, and kind of help understand that different people, because we talk about, you need to understand your followers, but your followers will be at different points in their development. And as a leader, you need to understand that, and you need to start saying, okay, I need to treat Joe different than I treat Betty, and I need to treat so-and-so better than, because they're at different points in their continuum. All sounds good. It's great. Where I've witnessed in different organizations, a lot of angst is when the follower and the leader don't agree that they're in the same quadrant of readiness. Different subject altogether. But if I'm treating you as if you're down on the low end and you think you're up on the high end, we're going to fight. So again, it's a model. All models are useful. All models have problems. Some are useful. So we go into that. And that's probably one of the ones that, I think this one's, we've seen it in about 400 of the Fortune 500 as models that fill into the whole leadership discussion. So one of the things that comes out of the discussion on, the situational approach to leaders is you've got a couple of choices. Leadership style needs to change to fit the situation. That makes sense. Leadership style needs to change to fit the followers. Makes sense as well. Or we change the situation to fit the leader, or change the followers. And as an old chief petty officer in the Navy friend of mine used to say, we had two choices. We can change people or change people. And so, it kind of says we have to look at situation, followers, the people, the skills, all of this has to be in the mix as we start looking at what is required of a leader at certain points. The drawback that I've seen with some of these approaches, and you've probably seen it in some of your organizations, is number one, this requires that the leader, now wait for it, actually has to get to know their followers. So they got to understand what motivates them, intrinsically. They got to understand, what their goals, what their needs, what their desires. They need to understand. They need to go out and like actually talk to their people, and not just walk through every once in a while, shake their hand, tell them they're doing a good job, and move on. When I've worked in organizations that I would say were not top-notch culturally, we tend to see these kind of issues around leadership is they have no idea, or they don't spend a lot of time understanding their people. They have this kind of, spray and pray mentality that just says, well, if I just treat everybody the same, life will be good. So in some cases, this has been an area where getting to know people, having a relationship, actually communicating is all kind of key components to this content, above and beyond understanding style, behavior, and situation. So in looking at these, we've got a couple of pros and cons. Major shift from traits to the focus on the behavior. So let's get away from the person. Let's talk about what the person does. Let's talk about what observable behavior can I see that would tell me that they have these things in mind. So there is a huge amount of research to support these, again, kind of crunch behaviors, situational contingency theories, lots of them. A lot of focus on the task that's underhand. So the situation where we find ourselves, are we in a crisis situation? Are we in a maintenance situation? Are we in a growth situation? What situation are we in? And the relationship between the leader and the led. Again, these have been used in tons of different organizations as kind of models of leadership. And the pro here is it stresses that the leader must learn their followers and adjust their style accordingly. Again, some of the cons, you can see those. Outcome again, we really haven't determined what's the best style. And for the Blake and Mouton, it kind of implies that high task, high relationship is the best. And I've seen some organizations that I've had to work in who said, we're not going to be happy till everybody is in that very highest quadrant, that they're on they're a 9 by 9 on the scale that says, we're high task, we're really focused, and we're really high relationship. I don't know if you can sustain that kind of level of effort for a long term without burning out both the followers and the leader. So it's, again, you've got to look at it as some kind of discussion around how much do we need to make this work. With the exception of the, and to some extent with the Hershey and Blake, there's still some ambiguity around the followers' development. How much, where's the line between the 1 and the 2 and the 3 and the 4? The other piece here, and it's always been a good argument against situational and contingency theory, is doesn't really address it addresses fully the one-on-one, but not group leadership. If I'm the leader of 500 people, is it really possible for me to really understand and get to know every single one of them? It's a good argument. I mean, I can see that argument. But it does look at more of the one-on-one. So we're going to start getting into some of the things here in a few minutes around, we've heard of this as transactional versus transformational theories. And this is starting to get us into we started seeing this, I don't know, mid-60s, probably a production of the San Francisco in the late 60s with this whole transformational studying thing. But what we saw was, the transactional piece is more of management of people. So we brought management back into it. So elements like supervision, performance, and all these were all brought in, but we looked at it then from kind of a continuum. We saw it as active and passive role as this transaction between a leader and a follower. And there was a lot of studies and a lot of looked at that relationship that says, okay, look, if you do this, I'll give you this. So very much a contract around, but from a leader standpoint, I still had to know what was intrinsically motivating you, so that I can make sure that as we move together up that continuum, you were getting what you need and I was getting what I need. So again, I'm still looking at the concern for the person, concern for the task, but I'm doing it with, kind of a little bit of, risk reward kind of relationship. And so there's an exchange, and there's actually a fairly reasonable instrument for looking at the leader-member exchange that kind of goes out and says, well, how much of this do you need to get? How much of that do I need? So I saw that and I said, well, that's pretty good, but let's talk about engaging and motivating and going back to that whole discussion of vision. And how do I get you to buy into this vision so that it becomes a common set, a common goal that we have? And then how do I, as a leader, start, actively and positively transforming you to make you better tomorrow than you were today? I actually had a boss for a period of time that he said his job was to make us more marketable tomorrow than we were today, to make us better individual performers, managers, leaders, et cetera, as we move forward, and to not get upset when other departments would come poach out of his department, because his job was to grow people and make them better, and he would see them out through the organization, and the organization was better for it. And he was constantly doing this. And I found it I always come back to that when I talk about the transformational leader. It was one that in my mind was very much in that role. So one of the things somebody decided to do was, gosh, you know what, if we have 10 different pieces, let's put them all together in one big model. Because why should we have 10 little models when one giant one would be good? And so they put it on this kind of a leadership continuum, if you will. They started off down here, you can see at the bottom, with kind of the transactional side, more of the laissez-faire, management by exception. So if you've ever had a manager who sits around and waits for you to make a mistake and then clobbers you, that's kind of where that's coming from. Or if they don't wait for you to make a mistake, but they predict when you're going to and clobber you ahead of time, that's more of the active role versus the passive role. So you kind of see that can be, carrot and stick, kind of beat you into submission. So no leadership at all, though laissez-faire, kind of doing this management by exception, both active and passive, and then getting into contingent reward theories, which is purely, you do this and I'll do this. You make 100, I'll give you $1. You make 200, I'll give you $1. So more contingent and reward around that. Purely transactional, tons of good research around those. Look at that, and of course I'm oversimplifying a lot of it. But then we start looking at then the more active side of this, where the leader has to be a little more active and understanding the followers around him. And looking at that again, kind of as a continuum. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to race up the top of this ladder and that all leaders aren't going to race up the top of this ladder. But looking at the leader is concerned for the followers and acts more like a coach than, it's kind of that, I'm going to help you be successful. You have this project or you're on this role. What do you need from me? And how can I help you? And how do I help guide you? It's your problem. I'm not going to solve it for you, but let's work together to solve this problem. And I can see where we can kind of make you better here. We can kind of work in those areas. And it's really kind of looking at that coach mentality. And then the next level, as we look at transforming people and making them better, is giving people the intellectual stimulation, where they encourage that creativity. And they ask a lot of questions. They don't give a lot of answers, more Socratic, but kind of saying, hey, let's play with this idea. Can we do, what do you think? Which in many cases, when I talk to different groups, and I say, well, what do you think? And they look at me kind of crazy, like, you're supposed to tell us. I'm like, you guys know more about your job than I ever will. So tell me what you think, and start, playing with ideas and being creative. And we move up that inspirational motivation, describing the vision, helping people get kind of turned on by the idea of doing this and working through there. And then the whole area around idolized influence, and looking at this as kind of how do we grow people as we kind of get through that. So kind of looking at the pros from the transactional side, get a good framework, shows, this whole thing, how what I do affects you transaction-wise, kind of practical, intuitively makes sense. You do this, I'll do this if you do this. Problem with it being, again, is the whole thing around there's motivation, intrinsic, extrinsic, expectancy theory, all that stuff, incredibly complex stuff and hard to get your brain around. So yes, makes sense on one side, hard to make sense on the other side. The other piece around that too, the transformational side, widely researched, nicely appealing. Everybody wants to be better off for the opportunity. And then research has shown that there's some effectiveness around it. The other side too, again, is there's a lot of concepts that are hard, that are not clear, that are not really clear. vision? How do you measure that? How do you measure trust? How do you measure motivation? They're difficult to define. Everybody's got an idea, but we kind of have a hard time. Trust and faith, those kind of concepts get hard to deal with. This one strays back into personality traits of leaders when we're not if we're not paying attention, and then sort of implies with that continuum that there's one best way, which not necessarily the case. So, in kind of want to put a kind of a wrap on what's going on now. Well, as we kind of moved into the 21st century, we had really good research on a lot of those things, all the way up to that full range models, transformation, a lot of research, a lot of studies. People looked at this 1,000 ways from Sunday. So as we go past that last piece, we start looking at, okay, what's coming up? And right now we've been seeing a lot of research or a lot of writing. Now, don't confuse writing and books and research and theories and probability. I always say I can tell how confusing a subject is by going to a bookstore and looking at how many linear feet are devoted to the subject. So there's a lot of linear feet of books on leadership, and a lot of it's nice philosophical writing. And some of the things that we're starting to see come out now are things like this authentic leadership. That's kind of a result of things like 9/11, the instability, WorldCom, Enron. We saw these financial scandals, stuff like that. So people have said, well, gosh, that was failures of leadership. What's the reciprocal? What are the one over that? And said, well, the authenticity of a leader needs to be really focused and, really putting things like morals and values and transparency and stuff like that. So you're starting to see a lot of books and theories and some research. There's not a ton of research that you can find on it yet. And by I mean a ton, like 20 years. The other piece you're starting to see is some around spiritual leadership, which really looks at values and a sense of calling as it moves into those. Many of you may have heard of servant leadership. That's been one that I've seen that book on many, many desks as I've done my industrial tourism. And it makes, from a standpoint of it makes sense. Well, it's been there. Greenleaf wrote that book about 40 years ago, but it's not until kind of recently that we started seeing some empirical research around how effective and those kind of things. So those are kind of some of the things we're starting to see research being done. Adaptive leadership, which is a lot of, confrontation of problems and challenges and be creative and helping followers work in that area. But again, we're kind of not, there's kind of not been a ton of research on a lot of these. Pros, hey, who doesn't want trustworthy leadership? And putting that in focus, I think is a pro. And then again, you see that there's some explicit moral dependence. That looks good. Puts followers first. Can't argue that. And then again, has that process component, which as a process guy, it's really easy for me to kind of see starts, begins. Downside, early stages of development research. Not a lot. We haven't started hooking it together. Some of the concepts are pretty vague. And there's been some look that says, that whole idea of servant versus leader kind of gets contradictory and confusing. So just kind of to put a little bit of a wrap on it, things have continued to evolve. Over time, we've shifted the discussion away from the person and into the conceptual roles. And then the same thing we've done where we're starting to shift away from leader and manager being the same thing so that we can break that out and make those two distinctly different X's that we can go after and kind of study separately as we go through. So, leadership versus role versus position, manager, et cetera. We've unpacked a lot of those concepts and we're really starting to look. And there's really some interesting stuff coming along when we start looking at those new theories and concepts that are coming out. But unfortunately, the final word is we've been studying this thing for so long. And the one thing we all agree is there's not really a common definition for what is a leader, which means we're going to continue to study it for a little bit longer. And with that, I'd be glad to open it up, Deepak, back to you with questions, comments, emotional outbursts.
Jeff, thank you very much. I thought that was very good webinar on the leadership. Folks, line is open. Please, if you have any question, enter your question into the question section on the right side panel. And Jeff, Brooks and I will assist you with your questions, and Jeff will answer your questions. Jeff, so I have one comment regarding the leadership that I recently read one article, and I thought it was eye-catching, or in my mind, that the definition of leadership. So the way the person has defined leadership is, leadership is a human activity where trust, empowerment, and delegation, those kind of activity happen. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's pretty good, definition, or the whatever the person has described. And actually it's match with your presentation, because you kind of cover or point out all those the factor. It's mostly the human activity, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I agree, and I've seen that definition, and you look at those things, and I firmly believe it doesn't fit. I like that definition. I like the one that I threw up there in the book. Not really fond of that first one around obedience. Not really a big fan of that. But the thing that is, okay, how do I take that definition and operationalize it? When I look at trust, I'm all for it. I haven't seen, and I work with some organizations on strategic and long-range planning and visioning and cultural assessments. And one of the things that I've seen in those kind of things is people say, okay, we're an organization that trusts each other. And so I've asked groups to do this experiment with that. I said, okay, if I was somebody who just walked into your organization for the first time, I know nothing about you, brand new, day one, and you say that you're an organization that trusts, tell me, what are the observable examples of behavior that I would see as I wandered around your organization that would tell me, yep, this is an organization that trusts? And once they stop looking at me like goats looking at a new gate, you kind of get this idea, it's like, oh, how do I know, how do I then, as a leader, what would I have to demonstrate behaviorally that says I'm actually operationalizing that? And empowerment's another one that you go through. I love it. I am fully behind it, but it's kind of like, okay, define it for me. Give me the three, so help me as a leader, especially organizationally, to be able to say, yes, we trust, we have a culture of trust, and this is what it means, and here's how we describe that. That's always an interesting one around, getting into those concepts.
Thank you, Jeff. I have one question. One of our audience has a question. Could you give us an example of spiritual leadership?
One of the things I found interesting, I did a little bit of work. I did a little bit of research back on that one, because as an emerging theory, spiritual leadership doesn't necessarily mean from a religious standpoint. There was an interesting study that was done in, it was in Fort Hood up in Waco, Texas, where they looked at some of the concepts around spiritual leadership and looked at it from the standpoint of less about the religious aspect of spirituality, but more about the calling. And is what we're doing as an organization a calling? I have a friend of mine who is a EVP with a food bank up in rural Maine, and the people in his organization, and which he helps lead, they're very much feel that they have a calling to provide these services to people who find themselves in a situation, maybe or maybe not of their own decided. But the piece that's the most interesting to me on that concept is around that whole piece of, are we here to make a paycheck? Or are we here to do better? Or are we here because we have a calling? And if that's the case and your culture is that way, then it makes it easier to just promote and lead people in that determination. And the morals and the values and all that come around behind that help as well.
Jeff, I want to go back to the trust issue. We've had for many years on our safety surveys a question which is worded, employees trust the information management provides about the company. It's a very important question. The survey correlates with accident rates, but it also correlates with management effectiveness in general. And I find that question reliable and valid. So cognitively, I can measure it. I could probably measure it behaviorally if I knew enough about what the company did.
Mm-hmm.
Then I could figure out how to see if but I'm usually willing to trust that if cognitively they say the employees trust it, that they do. But I got a question for you, and I'll start with a statement. We may not be able to define leadership, but we know it when we see it.
Absolutely.
Name a couple of people that you think were great leaders.
Ooh. That's always been an interesting conversation that we've had, and I've had this since when I first got into the whole concept of leadership study, is it depends on your definition.
Yes. So I'm trying to find out about your definition.
I'm more of a Norhouse. I'm more of a Norhouse policy, process guy, and one of the ones, and it depends on situation. I had the I don't know if it was a advantage or a disadvantage of doing some work with a little company called Tyco. Right about the time they sent their CEO to jail.
Tyco?
Yeah. And the new guy that came in was handed what I lovingly referred to as kind of a crap sandwich, and was said, "Okay, it's yours." And I watched for a short period of time that I was still there doing some work with him. He put in some behaviors, and he started working on this sense of urgency, and started working on if you're familiar with Cotter's work on change, started working on, what is sense of urgency? How do we get people to understand? How do we get rid of the past? What are the bold, definitive actions that I, as a guy who needs to turn this thing around, what are the behaviors I need to do? And he took a series of steps and brought people in, very inclusive. And I always look back and say, while I hopefully will never find myself in that situation, because I will never be given a company to run, that, being able to say, from that standpoint, from a process standpoint, these are the things that I need to do and be aware of. I need to balance that with how the people feel against that. So I was kind of impressed with that. And that was one just jumps to my top of my head right here.
So while we are...
you know how it worked.
Yes. Well,
so while we are waiting...
Go ahead, David.
Sorry, while we are waiting for a few more questions, I have just put the link on your chat section. That's the survey link. Please take a moment and complete the survey. Your feedback is very important for us, and that's how we can improve ourselves and deliver better and better webinar every month. So please take your time and complete the survey. Meanwhile, we are still waiting for some more questions. According to my timer, it's almost 6:58. So if you have any question, this is the last call for the question. If I don't see any question, then I would just say thank you very much for your time today. And what we will do is, if you attended this webinar for 45 minutes, we will provide you continuing education credit, and we'll also post this webinar on our human development and leadership website, and you will also have this recording on the human development and leadership website. Brooks, do you want to add anything before we conclude this webinar?
Yes, I do. I think this would be a fascinating subject for a panel discussion.
Yeah, these things are always fun to do with a group.
Right. I'm not sure how we pull that off, but let's talk offline. Let's talk offline one of these days.
All right.
Since you owe me a letter, we can make it a phone
I was
call.
going to say, I still owe you a phone call, Brooks, and I promise I'll get that.
Good.
So meanwhile,
Thank you
Brooks,
very much. I enjoyed it. It gave me a lot of thought.
I appreciate that.
And I guess
so
it's
Jeff and Brooks, while you are waiting for each other call, I'm concluding today's webinar. It's almost 7 o'clock, and thank you very much for attending. Jeff, you did pretty good job today, and we really appreciate your help.
I enjoyed it. You guys take care, and we'll talk to you again sometime in the future.
Great. Thank you very much.